urban development. And the other is to promote equal opportunity for all in Pennsylvania. Uh, we do this through Community Relations and Activities Task Force, which includes people from the Pennsylvania Attorney's General's Office, the Pennsylvania State Police, and other local and state and federal partners. We also have the PHRC advisory boards, which a couple of you that I saw here are members of, and we have them in the counties listed there, but there are others that have recently developed. So we also promote equality for all through those entities. And we also obviously work with local commissions in providing and promoting equality and equity for all. And of course, as I've always said, equality is what we all want, but equity is how we get there. The mechanisms that we put in place to ensure that everyone's barriers are considered as we strive for that equality. And in order to do that, everyone should start from the same place. Then some people have more barriers than others. And because they have these barriers, there are mechanisms and or resources that must be adjusted to ensure that they have a fair starting place so that they have the finish line, which is equality. We also work with advocacy organizations throughout the state to promote this equality and also training like these lunch and learns. And we train schools and employers, community organizations, real estate professionals, lending institutions, housing developers, and basically anyone in around housing, kind of a housing 360 view, if you will. So we're going to jump right into it. Talk a little bit about some of the laws that are affected by what we're going to talk about today. And obviously, the Federal Fair Housing Act of 1968 and the amendment of 1988, as well as the 504 Rehabilitation Act of 1973 and the Americans with Disabilities Act. And all of these kind of play a role in there, as well as the Pennsylvania Human Relations Act. The protected classes, and you'll see that there are more listed, and I have some that are starred. But the protected classes, as I try to be inclusive of the PHRC Act as well as the Fair Housing Act, are race, color, religion, national origin, sex, familial status, handicap, disability, and that's what we'll focus on today, use, handling, and or training of support or guide animals for disability, age, 40 and above, ancestry, and retaliation. And as I note there, the asterisks are for the protected classes within the Pennsylvania Human Relations Act. Now note, there are some local ordinances, city ordinances throughout the state that have additional protections, and I would encourage you to seek some guidance on that from your local jurisdictions, as there may be other protections available. The Fair Housing Act, the Fair Housing Amendment Act was expanded in 1988. And it was expanded to include disability and familial status, the presence of children, or the attempt to secure custody or even pregnancy. Also foster care, if families were looking for a place where they wanted to have maybe a foster child that they were going to get custody of, you could not deny them rental. And I remember as a kid growing up in Lancaster, still the advertising that would say no pets and no kids. And so when you put that into context and you look at 1988 as when the amendment actually was enacted, you know, I got married in 1987. So, and my son is about 30, 34 years old. It puts it into perspective of how young we are as a society with looking at the rights of individuals. And it's no wonder why we continue to struggle as a society in guaranteeing those rights. Now, the Fair Housing Act uses the term handicap instead of disability. Now, under the Act, the handicap means with respect to a person or mental impairment, which substantially limits one or more major life activities. This person would have a record of such an impairment, or it has been regarded as having such an impairment. This term does not include current illegal use of alcohol or controlled substance. All right. It would cover individuals that are in recovery, but not current users. So, what I want to do as part of this, in order to build in the why of choosing hoarding as our topic today, is to kind of get into the meat and bones of the definition. Okay, so when we look at physical or mental impairment, that includes any physiological disorder or condition, cosmetic disfigurement, anatomical loss affecting one or more of the following bodily systems like neurological, musculoskeletal, special sense organs, respiratory, including speech organs, cardiovascular, reproductive, digestive, and other urinary, hemic, lymphatic, skin, and endocrine, or any mental or psychological disorder, such as mental retardation, organic brain syndrome, emotional or mental illness, and specific learning disability. And so you'll see that we're gonna be focusing on the latter of these definitions. Now, in the term of physical or mental impairment, let's see, it includes but is not limited to some of these conditions, including the orthopedic, visual, speech, hearing impairments, cerebral palsy, autism, epilepsy, muscular dystrophy, multiple sclerosis, cancer, heart disease, diabetes, HIV, infection, mental retardation, emotional illness, drug addiction, other than addiction caused by current illegal use of controlled substance or alcoholism. Major life activities. Sometimes we get questions as to, well, it says major life activities, that's kind of vague. Actually, it's not, and it's broken down in the Act. Major life activities means functions such as caring for oneself, the ability to care for yourself, to perform manual tasks, to walk, to see, to hear, speak, breathe, learn, concentrate, to work. These are major life activities that when are curtailed by a condition would then fall under disability. Some of the examples of housing discriminations would include refusing to rent or sell housing, refusing to negotiate for housing, not even going to talk to you, maybe for whatever reason, but it's within a protected class. So in this particular case, maybe somebody has a learning disability or a speech impediment. And because of that speech impediment, some people decide, I'm not going to call that person back. It takes too long to explain this. Some renters may decide that because, or some property owners may decide that because of this, well, you know what, I know they have a maintenance request. I'll get to it when I get to it. I'll go take care of Mr. So-and-so in Unit B. He's always so eloquent. He's always so prompt. He's always available. This guy gives me more problems than others, so I'll wait. Making housing unavailable, denying a dwelling, setting different terms or conditions or privileges for the sale or rental of a dwelling, providing different housing service or facilities, falsely denying that housing is available for inspection, sale, or rental, and of course, steering and blockbusting. And of course, refusing to make reasonable accommodations or modifications. And today, our conversation is going to focus on this portion of it. So we have two basic categories that we look at when we're looking at discrimination cases. You have disparate treatment, which is the unfair or adverse action decision taken against an individual because of their race, their color, national origin, religion, sex, disability, handicap, familial status. And obviously in Pennsylvania, we include those that are 40 and above and users and handlers of trainers or support animals. One example of this could be, and I use the familial status example here, I cannot rent the apartment to you because you have small children and I'm concerned about them falling off the balcony. This is a clear example, and it shows a direct evidence of discrimination. And direct evidence is basically somebody that told you why they are denying you the unit. They came out and told you, or in some cases, we've seen where they have emailed us the reason. And it's direct evidence of the denial. So usually disparate treatment of the person is a consequence of direct evidence. In other words, the direct evidence of the reason why I didn't rent to you is XYZ. Then you have disparate impact, which is the unfair adverse policy or practice or test that appears neutral on its face, but has a negative effect on individuals because of their race, color, national origin, religion, sex, disability, handicap, or familial status. And an example of this, and I'll use an advertising example, but 4-bedroom home available for a Christian family. This advertisement would have a negative impact on individuals that would not consider themselves to be Christian. And is that a reason to not rent to someone? Now, as recently as September, HUD has come down with a new disparate impact rule that kind of makes it difficult for a complainant to be able to bring a disparate impact complaint. It has 5 criteria that the complainant must meet in order to establish their burden, and that makes it a little tougher. And so it's not like it used to be before, where you could just say, well, no, this statement here has a disparate impact. Nowadays, you have to follow those 5 criteria. Now that's the rule, and the only way to get to that is by knowing those rules. If anybody wants a copy of that, I could certainly send it to you in the email that you provided today. Let's get into hoarding, because this is takes a little longer to explain. So since 2013, the American Psychiatric Association has recognized that hoarding is a mental disability. The diagnostic criteria for hoarding include the persistent difficulty in discarding or parting with possessions regardless of their actual value, a perceived need to save items and distress associated with discarding them, the accumulation of possessions that congest and clutter living areas and substantially compromises their intended use, and clinically significant distress or impairment in social, occupational, or other areas of functioning, including maintaining an environment that is safe for oneself and others. And so when you look at hoarding, and we were looking at protected classes, well, here, this 2013 American Psychiatric Association kind of lays out that hoarding is a mental disability and therefore covered by the Fair Housing Act. And they say that because most of the people associated with hoarding, or people that are diagnosed with a hoarding disorder, usually are individuals that are obsessive compulsive. They have an obsessive compulsive personality disorder, obsessive compulsive disorder, and attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, or ADHD. And so, as you see from the picture there, it's pretty an astonishing picture as to an example of hoarding. So the intent today is not to have people diagnose hoarding, because then you're regarding an individual as having a disability. And if there are any property managers or landlords at this lunch and learn, it's not that I want you to diagnose, but I want you to know what it looks like. I also want housing advocates to know what it looks like when they're dealing with hoarding, and hopefully come up with viable solutions. Now, I want to ask the group here, and you can chime in on your message there. Is this picture a depiction of hoarding, or is this clutter? You could either unmute yourself and let me know, or you can type it into the message. I'll give you a couple of minutes to do that.
I think it's.
If you want to chime in, go ahead. You don't have to keep it interactive.
I think it could possibly depend on the individual, and we would need more information.
Okay, thank you, Todd. Anyone else?
I think it's clutter, because the space is still being used for, look like what it's used for, and you can still walk through it.
Okay, thank you, Heather.
Yeah, as a writer and not that organized, it would be cluttered to me, because that's what one of my rooms look like.
Very good. Thank you, James. Appreciate it. All right. So yeah, in effect, this is actually clutter. And so one of the ways that we do this, and you mentioned, James, you're a writer. So as a musician, my music room looks a little like this, I'll admit. There's musical composition seats all over the place. Uh, instruments all over the place, the keyboard and the whole 9 yards. And so what we see in this picture is we see things that pretty much belong together. This appears to be a media room. I mean, I can see the vinyl there. I can see the stereo equipment, the turntable. There are magazines. There's a computer there, a TV in the corner. There's a printer over here and various books and magazines. It's kind of a reading room, and it's also a media room. And to Heather's point, it's still you're still using it for its intended use. In other words, if that's what it is, the fact that everything's kind of thrown around, it's because it's being used actively. It doesn't look abandoned. And as you can see, the absence of general refuse. I mean, everything here goes together, right? I always liken it to the game that you would play in Sesame Street back in the day, where you would say which of these things don't belong, where everything here clearly belongs together, okay? As opposed to, say, this room. I think we can all agree, based on that criteria that I just outlined, that this probably is not clutter. Am I right or am I wrong?
You're right.
Yeah, it's definitely hoarding. And again, the absence of any disorganized organization that is involved with clutter is a clue. I mean, here, if we played that game, which of these things don't belong? Well, obviously, we have Domino's and Burger King, and we've got a bunch of other cups and shoes and gallon jugs and 2-liter grape soda jugs and clothing strewn all over the place, no real organization. And the most important thing is that I can see in the corner there that there's one, not just one, but 2 TVs. They put one on top of the other one because, the level is starting to grow there. But it is not, I believe, that the clothing is stacked on top of a sofa, but you really can't tell. And so this room is no longer available for its intended use, which is as a living room.
Mr. Garcia,
Yeah.
but to the hoarder, could this make perfect sense? And could they rationalize it?
Oh, and many times they do. Absolutely. It's why it takes such a while to be able to work through, and we're going to talk a little bit about a reasonable accommodation plan, but it takes a while to get through. And this is why service providers are such an important entity to partner with. If someone is a housing advocate or if someone is a landlord, property owner, it is important for them to get connected through local channels with their service providers that will be able to have the time. They have this in their mission, and at the same time have the expertise to be able to deal with that. Because you're absolutely right, Todd. They do rationalize it. I've heard anything from, well, the thrift store is there, and I go there every day, and every day I buy something and I bring it in, and because there it is, so it just got out of control. Get it? And so many of the rationalizations goes through that. However, remember that most of the conditions associated with hoarding were obsessive compulsive disorder and ADHD, among others. So yes, they will rationalize, and it's absolutely important that's addressed, because you cannot begin to work through this if someone is not there that is trained to be able to respond to that rationalization. Does that make sense?
Oh yeah, sure.
I put this in here because when I started doing this presentation, I reached out to the Institute for Challenging Disorganization and spoke to their CEO. They're a nonprofit out of New York, And I like this chart. And again, the intent is not to diagnose or to have anyone diagnose, but it kind of gives you an idea. And so what I heard from them is that the yellow category, the elevated category, which is level 3, is what they call their pivot point, right? Level 1, they have 5 stages that they look at within each level. Anything from the animals and the care of the animals to the structural, anything that had to do with the structural of the dwelling, the structure of the dwelling, and so on. So they look at it on every level. And so what they're telling me is that in stage 3, that is the pivot point. That is where that gray area between what would be considered clutter to actual hoarding, that's where it occurs. Because at this point, you're beginning to lose the intended use of whatever room it is. There is significant refuse involved, and so on. So I put this in here as kind of a guide, and you could certainly look up the Institute for Challenging Disorganization. The PHRC nor I are acting as a reference for them, but I thought that this chart was easier for, say, a landlord or a housing advocate to kind of follow. And if there are others, you could certainly research those as well. So here again, they talk about the clutter hoarding scale, and they have 5 categories, and this is structure and zoning, animals and pests, household functions, health and safety, and personal protective equipment. They basically look at these 5 levels, and within those 5 levels, they look at all of these categories, and that's how they determine whether or not they've got hoarding in their midst. The reason, again, I added this is because I thought it was kind of handy. It gives you kind of a general idea. And I will share this with you. I'll send this to your email. I do have a much cleaner copy than the one that you're looking at on your screen. So all that to say that under the Fair Housing Amendment Act, the person who suffers from hoarding may be entitled to reasonable accommodations of policies and practices or services when accommodations may be necessary to afford a person an equal opportunity to enjoy the dwelling. And of course, we cited the appropriate section there. So how do we go about this, right? So they can do that. Great. We know that they can, but how? How do we even broach the subject? So I would say to landlords and landlords that communication is key. And one of the things I kept saying in one of the trainings, I think it was yesterday. Yeah, yesterday I had a training with somebody else, and I said to him, you have to establish your communication style. And I've said this to tenants as well. Back when we did the rental advantage course at LHOP, one of the things that I would tell prospective tenants is, you've got to remember what you were like the day you made that first call to that prospective landlord. And whatever was your demeanor then, that should be your communication style moving forward. So I say the same thing to landlords. You've got to have that same enthusiasm and care and customer service that you had when you went showing and touring the unit. You've got to keep that demeanor when you're dealing with this kind of relationship, because you don't know if one of the individuals may have some of those conditions that would lead to hoarding. And so having an open communication is important. So let's take a scenario, for example, of a landlord walking into, or a property owner walking in, doing an inspection and finding some deficiencies. And among those deficiencies are stage 3 hoarding. Though that landlord won't be able to define it, the only thing the landlord will see is that, okay, I can barely walk through here. There's a lot of refuse. I can't get to the utility panel. And so for them, the first thing that will come up is, this is a violation of our lease because there are cleanliness standards and health and safety standards that are not being met. And so they will go to their office and they will send a a violation notice. And so this typically what ends up happening is that that tenant will then make a call to a local organization. In my case back then would have been LHOP. I'm sure it's still the case that LHOP gets these calls, and they will talk about, I'm receiving this violation, and they're threatening with evicting me, and I don't know what to do. And so, and I've gotten these calls. One such call was when a woman who had moved into a smaller apartment or a smaller unit. They moved into the smaller unit, husband, wife, and their teenage child. Within a month or two of moving in, the husband dies. And so now the wife, who had a part-time at the time, and the teenager that also had a part-time at the time, they made decisions. So they've decided, I've got to take all the stuff that we had in storage because I can't afford to pay for that storage, and I've got to put it all in this house. Okay, and so obviously there's an attachment to the stuff that she's put in the house. During a routine inspection or a maintenance call, the property manager comes in and sees all this stuff. And at this point, he's saying, no, you're violating our standards. I can barely walk through here. There's stuff all over the place. There's stuff on the stairs, stuff in the basement. And he's like, you got 30 days to deal with this or you're out of here. So at that point, that's going to be pretty much how most property owners and most property managers are going to handle it. Because remember, their job is to rent properties, to adhere to the laws, obviously, but they're there to rent properties. And when they see a violation, the only recourse they have is to send out a violation notice. So open communication is important. And so what we've been doing and what we're trying to do today is to put the word out that, if you see the violation as a property owner, that property owner should inform the resident. Give the list of specific lease violations in person and in writing. Go over each specific violation in stages if necessary, and show the resident the evidence. Look, I can barely walk through here, or I can't get to the utility panel. The vents are covered. You have stuff near the radiators, or you have stuff near the gas fireplace, or what have you. Show the hazards. Offer to make a reasonable accommodation. And sometimes what we think of is, we think of a reasonable accommodation as a one-way street. We think that that reasonable accommodation should be coming from the tenant all the time. And yes, it is, but it doesn't always come in as a reasonable accommodation. If a landlord says to a tenant, wow, this is a violation, there's too much stuff here, it's becoming a health and safety issue, you need to do something about this. And the tenant in turn says, yeah, and I've been trying to, but I've been sick and I've been, going through. To me, that sounds like somebody that needs help. To me, that sounds like a reasonable accommodation request. So open communication is to then come up and say, okay, well, is there anyone you can call? Is there anyone you're working with? Is there a doctor that you're working with? Is there anyone that in your family that can come in, help you clean this up? Maybe we can put a plan together. So that's where we're headed with this. Offer to help in removing and clearing. And I have a landlord that actually did that. He actually said to the tenant, I'll tell you what, go through your stuff. The stuff that you absolutely need to keep, I will come and pick up every week, and I will put it into a storage unit. That's what the landlord did, because he knew he had a good tenant in hand, but he also knew he had a tenant that was ill. He just didn't know how to deal with this situation. Going to the next slide here.
Adrian, I have a question about that.
Sure.
About reasonability. Can you go back to the slide you just left?
Absolutely. Okay.
So this is where I think it gets tricky for most landlords. In this piece, the key word, operative word in that being reasonable accommodation. So what is reasonable? So you've gone down this list and you've shown the resident the evidence. This is your room. So that room you showed, I believe some people thought it was a living room. I was thinking that it was a bedroom. And I'll tell you that simply because of the nature of the type of things that were being kept in the room. It was majority clothes. So it's a room that probably you get dressed in. So
Mhm.
I don't know. We don't know because there was so much stuff to the point where you
It's
couldn't
hard to
see
tell.
whether there was a couch, whether there was a bed or what it was. So there was no walkway. There was McDonald's wrapper. There was a pizza box. But now you've got the issue of bugs. You've
Mhm.
got vermin. So what if I were a landlord, what I would ask is it reasonable for you to expect me to sift through this pile that now has cat feces, dog feces, whatever manner of vermin, there's roaches, there's everything. So now this is transferring to my other tenants. If I have a 12-unit apartment house and there's 12, and this one hoarder house is now transferring to everyone else. So now we've got a building-wide problem. So in terms of responsibility to the tenant and accommodation for their disability and the landlord's responsibility, where is that line? And I know that this is a newer area of housing that we're
Mhm.
dealing with here.
It's a great question. And here's the thing, this is why I've said a couple of times that it is tricky because landlords have to be careful on what they say. They can't come up and diagnose it, but they can come up and say, according to our lease, here's where the violations are, and then begin that communication by saying, is there anyone that you can trust to help you with this? Is there anyone that we can sit down together and come up with a plan? Because either way, he's not going to be able to evict this individual from one day to the next. There's a step. There's a notice, and then there's the hearing. So he's got that time. And so my communication to most landlords has been, let's take that time that you would have used for that to try and see if we can have somebody come in and help them, and start with family members and say, you're going to need to clean this up. I mean, the best advice for any property owner or manager is to stay in your lane, use that lease provision that speaks to this, and then open yourself up to say, can we put a plan together? Is there anyone that can help you? I'm willing to give you 30 days to get this cleaned up. And so it's also important that property managers and owners kind of have some familiarity with some of the local organizations, some of the community benefit organizations that deal with the disabled or VHDS. Why? Because like any business, the more you know, the better you are in your business, right? And so that's basically how I've answered in the past. I don't know if that completely answers your question, but this begins to be about the communication. And so the gray area that you're alluding to is, there is no gray area. I need the property manager and the property owner to stick to their lane, but based on their communication, and as I think it was Tim that said earlier, depends on the person. Well, this also depends on that communication style that the property owner or manager has with that tenant. If there's been animosity, if there's been no collegial relationship, it may be tougher. But property managers should and landlords should take the first step in saying, is there anyone that can help you do this? The minute you hear somebody say, I don't have anyone that can help me, I have no family, and da 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 da, you can say, well, do you go to church? Is there someone that can help you from your friends, anything like that? Would you like me to call someone that deals with maybe getting rid of some of this stuff, that they can make a plan with you? So start just kind of grasping at straws until you get something where that tenant actually agrees and says, yeah, I could really use some help. And then as the property owner, all you do is you kind of get them connected, and you're part of that plan, but you're not involved in removing the stuff yourself. That's going to become a contentious relationship, because believe it or not, in that mess that you saw in that bedroom, living room, whatever it was, there's a lot of emotional sentiment to everything that's been kept there. And so the minute the landlord decides, well, I'm going to come in here and clean this up, that becomes contentious. Always better to have a professional in the mix. And that's what this next slide kind of gets into. I hope that kind of answers your question, Tamika.
It did. Thank you.
So, and again, here's what I was talking about. To develop a reasonable accommodation plan, involve a service provider in the plan if possible. They have time, they have expertise. It's part of their mission. Make an agreement through the court, so that the resident understands, hey, this is serious. I got to get this done. If I don't get this done, I'm out. Um, and so it's enforceable. So it'll include a lease addendum, because the idea is you want this to be a permanent solution. So reasonable accommodations should include specific standards for specific areas. So there should be also a timeline for each step and a deadline. It should also outline who's going to do the removal, all right? Who's going to check in and how often? What services the resident will accept. Now, this looks like a lot for a property owner to do, but remember, ideally, this is being done in partnership with a service provider, a trained service provider, someone in the social service area that has dealt with this in the past. Mental Health America is a company that I've reached out to, and they were able to send someone in and help the individual whose landlord said, if you start getting things together and putting them in boxes and actually, naming what you have in those boxes, I will take that stuff and put it in my storage. So that landlord was involved, but he stuck to his lane and allowed the professional to come in and help transition and work through this. So who will do the removal, the services that resident will accept? That's a conversation that's going to be between that social service provider and that resident. Relevant releases, if any, a method to ensure the permanent resolution of a problem. So it may be that we're gonna do inspections every 3 months, intense inspections every 3 months for the first year, and if we see that this is maintained, we're going to taper off of that. Some kind of something, and where this happens, we end up seeing success, and that is a reasonable accommodation to a disability that was assorted related to hoarding. Now, hoarders in violation of codes and lease meet the definition of a disability, and you must offer to make a reasonable accommodation plan. That comes in different forms, right? Because again, as the landlord and the property owner and the property manager, you've got to stay in your lane. So it's not like you coming up with, oh, would you like a reasonable accommodation plan? No, it always starts with, is there anyone that can help you? Because this is a health violation, and this is going to affect my other tenants, as Tamika explained earlier. I need to be able to get this in control. I can give you 30 days. I'm going to send you a notice, a written notice. We've talked about it. I'm going to send you a note, but you need to be able to get somebody in. Is there anyone that I can help you call? There are also organizations that can help you clean up some of this stuff. I can make a call and have them come in, and we can make a plan together. What I'm talking about is a collaborative plan, somewhere where, because at the end of the day, landlords got into the business of renting units for money. And so I don't think any property owner got into this business so that they could be evicting people no, they want to have people there because a stable tenant equals income stability for them. And so this allows for them to have a different way of looking at things. Yes, you're in your lane and you're taking care of business, but at the same time, part of taking care of business is making sure that you always have income. One of the ways to do that is keeping your residents housed. You almost always need a court involvement, although in my case, that has not been true. I've done a couple of these through an informal housing resolution and constant monitoring, and they have gone well. I believe, I think Brittany is also, I think if she's on, Brittany's also probably done a couple of these from LHOP, where you just kind of keep monitoring and bringing in a third party social service provider. And then the resident also needs a permanent plan. So I wanna start taking questions here because I've seen some things happening in my chat. There are 32 things in the chat. So let's see. Are there any? I can't open up my chat. Can you open up the chat there, Tamika? See if there are any questions on there.
Yes, there is a question from Dr. Carolyn Princess. She asked, she was looking at the room, the question came through when the room was full of junk, the hoarding room. Could this be considered a storage area?
It
Could they
could.
call it that?
They could. They're gonna use a lot of rationalizations, and that certainly could be one that could be considered reasonable. But it would be reasonable to the individual, not perhaps reasonable to, say, the property owner or the property manager if they were doing an inspection. They may look at that and say, well, there's a fire hazard. You can't use the room. This could bring about vermin and insects and affect other people in the building. Are there any other questions?
Vanessa notes that the interactive process is important. And she's absolutely right about that. And so what you've been talking about is the communication piece, the going back and forth. That is what, for those who are not in this industry, what we would term the interactive process, going back and forth with the parties to see what you can do to try to make the situation right, interacting with people.
And that's such a great point, Renessa, and thank you for the clarification on the interactive process, Tamika. I have always been a proponent of the more communication you have between the landlord and tenant, the more open relationship that is, the more you can solve and the less eviction that you might see. That communication, it becomes stellar. Remember, you communicated to get the apartment, and the property owner or renter communicated to get that tenant. Why does the communication end after that happens? And so in many cases, tenants feel that I've rented this, I'm in. As tough as housing is to get, I'm in. I don't want to bother the landlord for anything. If I can take care of myself, I will. Yes, I understand that and I sympathize with that. However, in order to truly maintain an open line of communication, just keep on using that same method of communication that you used when you acquired the apartment. People will respond positively if there's an open line of communication. And when it comes to something like this, where health and safety is involved, yeah, it's important for the property owner to stay in their lane, but it's also important for them to think outside the box and say, how do I keep my tenant housed so I can keep that income coming in, but without these violations? And understanding that it may be necessary to have a third party come in and assist. There's nothing wrong with that. Collaboration is a great thing. So any other questions on that?
So we have a comment from James Johnson. He says, even with good communication, I still had a hoarding issue despite a great relationship. And he says that this is great information. So I think that people are realtors and landlords are really wanting to know about this question, because to your point, Adrian, once people are in, the thought process is I'm in and that's it now. Like, okay, well, as long as I pay my rent on time, I don't want the landlord in my bed. And we know this is true for renters. If you've ever been a renter or a landlord, you deal with people or like in our communities, our thing is, don't want you in my business. You're the landlord. I gave you your rent. This is my home now. I don't want you coming in here. So now you've got codes violation issues that is bringing the landlord to the place. And so they send a notice on Friday, November 20th, we will be exterminating. Please call and give me a time where we can enter the unit. If you don't come, we will be entering the unit somewhere along the day between the hours of 9 and 3. Now the person is frantic. What am I going to do about this situation? Or they come in and they find this and it's a problem. And you're so right, Adrian, when you say that, well, they're in it to make money. So people, it costs money to go through eviction procedures and all of that. But for the landlord piece, they run the risk of losing their other tenants if they are not able to get this one situation under control, because who wants to live in a place that's vermin infested?
And I'll tell you that really what adds to that is our inconsistency at the state level of having a consistent lease or a universal lease that addresses some of these issues, that has those habitability issues outlined, that have the quiet covenant of enjoyment outlined. The lack of uniformity in the lease structure also adds to this, because what ends up happening is many property owners that get into it didn't go to college for this. They just saw that they were able to buy or maybe inherited a property, and it's an investment property. But they don't know many times all of the rules and regs associated with their chosen industry now. And so they basically are learning through trial and error. If we had some consistency that helped the landlords, if we had perhaps an independent landlord education certification problem, or not problem, but a program where they could be certified as a landlord, they would learn all of these things. I think this communication piece would be part of that mantra for all those landlords. And as James said, even with open communication, sometimes it is impossible. A lot of that has to do with the rationale, the severity of the issue that the person may be having, their mental health issue that they may be having, the lack of support, the lack of knowledge of other organizations that might be around that may be able to help in getting this resolved. This is why it's important that as I would tell any property owner or manager, it's important not to live in an island. You know, there are various elements that affect people's housing. And because you have chosen to be in the housing industry, you need to be aware of some of the organizations that can help you in your chosen business, that would make you stronger, that would make you more successful as a property manager or owner. And one of these is knowing what local organizations are there to assist when something like this happens. Landlording is not a building business, it's a people business. You've chosen to get into it, and therefore you've got to deal with the complexities that sometimes people bring with them. Any other questions?
Speaking of resources, you're queuing me right up here, Adrian.
All right.
Harold Goldner provides us with a resource. He says that resources are available at www.
Oh, Tamika, we lost you. Let's see here.
I posted the website, Adrian, for the actually probably the organization you were associated with.
Okay, thank you. I appreciate that.
I had a question for you, Adrian. Some
Sure.
Local ordinances exclude private residences, say where somebody is renting out a garage apartment or a bedroom or multiple bedrooms in their home. Does the PHRA under the fair housing laws, do they exclude these types of facilities as well?
By exclude, what do you mean? I mean,
Me,
our exemption is that one unit. We're different from HUD in this sense. HUD says, you know, that they have jurisdictions over any properties that, or any property owner that has 4 or more properties. In the Pennsylvania Human Relations Act, we have jurisdiction over a property owner that may only have 1 property. However, if you're looking at those, let's say the in-law quarters or a garage that's been converted into that, which many ordinances prohibit, if it's prohibited by the ordinance, then it's probably not going to qualify within our jurisdiction. And I'll say that with a caveat. We'd have to look at it on a case-by-case basis, because it really depends on what the case brings about. Does that help answer your question a little bit?
yeah, thank you.
Adrian, I have a question.
Okay, go ahead.
So I know in Maryland, you have different local government agencies, like Baltimore County and Baltimore City, and they actually have the rental property registration and licensing program. But do they not have that in the Commonwealth? Because I haven't seen anything like that here.
Very good question. As a Commonwealth, as you know, we govern from the bottom up. So there's no standardized property maintenance or rental maintenance code out there. In fact, I know that in Lancaster County, we were going through and doing a survey, and out of the 61 municipalities in Lancaster County, only 32 of them, I believe, and somebody from LHOP can correct me, 32 of them had some semblance of a rental ordinance, and it varies from having staffed rental ordinance people that would inspect units to others that just have a complaint based, you call when there's a complaint, but they don't really have dedicated staff to it. So it really does vary. It's one of my pet peeves, one of the ones that I'm trying to get an audience for and see if we can't do better at, because what we have seen through the calls at my previous job is that when you look at the quality of housing for individuals of color, for single parent families, for individuals settling here from other countries, for the elderly and individuals with disabilities, they're the ones that are living in these properties that are substandard and are not governed by any property maintenance code. They're the ones that are stuck with this. And so that unfortunately is a consequence of not having a standardized rental policy like that.
Okay. Yeah, that makes sense, because with all the problems that you've been discussing, it's a great output for landlords and tenants, because you have to register every 2 years.
Right.
Make sure that your smoke detectors are up to date, to make sure you have access to get out in case there's a fire. I mean, yeah, it's, and they have a lot of information that can be provided to both parties. Okay, thank you.
Valerie, I appreciate that. And Todd mentioned that in Philadelphia, landlords are supposed to be licensed and understand their obligations. Very true. And again, when we govern from the bottom up, that opens the opportunity for individual township, boroughs, and cities to be able to according to the needs and the way their community works, to be able to establish those ordinances. But wouldn't it be nice if we had a standardized practice that started at the state level that encouraged a more uniform way of doing that? So yeah, that's a very good point. Thank you. Let's see what else I have here.
Adrian, last question is, in your experience, how aware are magistrates of this requirement? So when people are going to court, how are the local district justices responding? Are they just evicting people outright? Are they telling landlords, okay, you have to engage and help them out? Like how are they doing? They're just throwing people out?
Yeah, because here's the thing, as a magistrate, you get that eviction notice and the reason for the eviction notice. And so magistrates are basically looking at that. And even though the tenant may say, I have a disability and I've been trying to work with somebody in doing this, some magistrates feel empowered to come up and say, well, I'm not here to talk about that. I'm here about this eviction notice, and I need you to address this eviction notice. Those that are a little bit more informed are going to come up and say, really, you're working with someone? And then look at the landlord and say, well, how long has that been going on? Well, she's been working on it, but we've been doing this for 3 months. And has there been any progress? Some of those magistrates will dig a little deeper and say, has there been any progress? And if so, okay, I'll tell you what, since there's been some progress, we're going to go ahead. We're going to stay this for another 30 days and see how much progress we can come up. I want you to work it out on your own. It doesn't happen all the time, but most of those magistrates, they're just looking at what's in front of them and reacting to it accordingly. This is why it's important to have the conversation on the front end between that landlord and that tenant, because at the end of the day, each party wants something. The tenants want to stay in their home, and landlords want to keep a property that is clean and will produce income for them. I want to thank everyone for making it out today and for your questions and interaction. I appreciate it. My information is there. We'll have your emails. I'll go ahead and send you out the presentation, and I'll also send out the evaluation. If you could fill that evaluation out and just send it back. It's the way I kind of track how we're learning and what people liked, what they didn't like, and how I could adjust. And so I'd greatly appreciate it if you return that. If there are no more questions, I thank you for coming out. Thank you, Tamika, for helping out as always.
Thank you. Have a good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.